Hey, so I want to talk a bit about the new UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, but also more broadly about the organization. I imagine there'll be other videos I make along these lines, so I'm not going to make this too lengthy. But there are a number of things I want to touch on. Antonio Guterres has become the ninth UN Secretary General. He took office on the 1st of January. His deputy is Amina Mohammed of Nigeria, and she will be assuming some of the administrative roles, which is why the deputy position was first created. Now, the UN Secretary General is a very unusual position because, on one hand, it's very high profile. On the other hand, the power is greatly debatable. Um, Franklin D. Roosevelt sort of envisaged the role of a UN Secretary General back in 1945 as a sort of policeman of the world, in a sense. Um, and I'm just going to go through a brief history of Secretary Generals. Um, the first actual transitionary Secretary General was British, Gladwin Jebb from 1945 to 46, although he was in a transitionary position as the position was being set up, so he's not always classed as a UN Secretary General. The first de facto UN Secretary General was Trygve Lie of Norway, 1946 to 1952. And a quick disclaimer at this point, if I mispronounce any names, apologies for that. Trygve Lie was followed by Dag Hammarskjöld of Sweden, who served from 1953 to 1961. He tragically died in a plane crash in Rhodesia on his way to peace talks in the Congo crisis, and has been a number of conspiracy theories around that. Dag Hammarskjöld was also the first person to succeed a UN Secretary General, and Christiane Amanpour put it to Ban Ki-moon that she put that was a position that Dag Hammarskjöld faced, that he was adopting arguably the most impossible job in the world, and I'll come to that in a minute. The third UN Secretary General U Thant of Burma, 1961 to 1971. The fourth UN Secretary General, Kurt Waldheim, 1972 to 1981, who faced some controversy over the fact that he'd been a member of the Austrian equivalent of the Hitler Youth. Javier, I think that's pronounced Javier Perez de Cuellar of Peru, 1982 to 1991. And at 96, he's the oldest living former UN Secretary General. He's also the oldest living former Prime Minister of Peru. Boutros Boutros-Ghali, 1992 to 1996. He passed away last year at the age of 91, I believe. Ghali had one of the hardest tenures because during his time was the Rwandan genocide, when the UN was really seen to be a complete failure in that crisis. He's also one of the only one-term UN Secretary Generals. That could be why, when he passed away last year, it didn't make as many headlines as you might think for someone in such a prominent position. Kofi Annan, 78, of Ghana, currently 78, that is, 1997 to 2006. Annan was probably one of the more popular Secretary Generals, widely respected diplomat. Ban Ki moon, the outgoing UN Secretary General, he's currently 71, served from 2007 to 2016. And the new man, Antonio Guterres, is 67. A little bit of background on Mr. Guterres. He served as Prime Minister of Portugal. He's a socialist. He served as Prime Minister of Portugal from 1995 to 2002. He was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees from 2005 to 2015. So certainly on the surface, he seems to have a pretty robust CV. Now, before I talk about the challenges that Mr. Guterres has, um, a quick word on Ban Ki-moon, quick few words, I should say. Um, on the more negative side of his legacy, I'll start with that first. He had to deal with several high-profile scandals directly involving UN staff. The allegations that UN staff deliberately introduced cholera to Haiti, the sexual abuse scandals involving UN peacekeepers in the Central African Republic, Sudan, and Haiti, and arguably the failure to deal with the crisis in Syria. Now, it wouldn't be fair, I think, to put that all on Mr. Ban personally. Nevertheless, it was his tenure as UN Secretary General. On the more positive side of his legacy, arguably his greatest achievement was overseeing the Paris Climate Agreement last year, 2015, which was a hallmark agreement. All the great powers signed up to that. So that can probably be seen as his crowning achievement. And it may well reverse some of the direction the world is going in terms of tackling man-made the man-made influence of carbon emissions in the atmosphere and so on. Gender equality, Ban has been a tireless campaigner for this, and I think he deserves credit for bringing issues like girls' education to the forefront. And also, and this is a notable point, Ban is South Korean. He comes from a very conservative society. Um, and he's a middle-aged South Korean man, and yet he has not been shy about talking about LGBT rights. So I do think he deserves credit for that because coming from the society that he comes from, which is quite conservative, um, I know Christian Amanpour raised this point. It's something that he could have ignored, he could have downplayed, but he didn't. So I give him credit for that. And human rights. Now, this is something that we can't hardly say that Ban Ki moon's time in office, there has been a drastic change in the world situation regarding human rights. Clearly, there's still enormous, massive violations out there. Nevertheless, I think Ban deserves credit for not being afraid to talk about this, um, perhaps more so than some other UN Secretary Generals. And I do think he deserves credit for that. I think it's an extremely important issue. And there are certain authoritarian regimes that see human rights as a dirty term. Um, so, all in all, Ban hasn't had a perfect record, but then again, I don't think any UN Secretary General has. I think he's tried his level best in a very difficult job. And honestly, on a personal level, I've always liked Ban. I think he's a thoroughly decent man with a very difficult job. But the point about the UN Secretary General is no one should expect any UN Secretary General to come out of their office leaving the world in a perfect state. It's never going to be that way because one person cannot be expected to solve all the world's problems. No world leader is expected to do that. So it should be even less of a surprise that basically a high level diplomat with arguably the toughest or at least most complex job in the world can do that. And the thing about the UN Secretary General is that he or she, and actually, I'll just briefly touch on that. There was some controversy about the fact that the new Secretary General isn't a woman. There's been 8 men, now a ninth man, no women. Perhaps that is something that should be remedied the next time round. But looking at his CV, I can't see any reason why Mr. Guterres isn't capable of the job, and that is the most important thing. Um, Another aspect, sorry, I'm backtracking a little bit, but another aspect is he's another West European. There's already been at least three, four West Europeans with Kurt Waldheim, Trygve Lie, Dag Hammarskjöld. So Mr. Guterres will be the fourth. I wasn't including Gladwin Jeb, which would then make him the fifth. There's so far been no representation from Eastern Europe, so I think next time round, next UN Secretary General should perhaps be from Eastern Europe. But in theory, there should be a rotationary system with this. Anyway, what people need to remember is that basically the UN Secretary General is a very high level diplomat, and whoever holds that post doesn't have absolute power. In a sense, their job is to referee the great powers, but as Mark Malloch Brown, who's one of Britain's top diplomats, he advises Mr. Guterres to kind of play your cards right. In other words, stand up to the UN Security Council when necessary, but also know when they're going to say no. So the truth be told, no diplomat, no individual diplomat has the power to stand up to America, to stand up to China, to stand up to Russia. I'm thinking of those three countries in particular. But there's two other countries, of course, in the Security Council, which is Britain and France. Now, one of the main criticisms of the UN Security Council is that it's not inclusive enough. So you have five powerful countries: the US, China, Russia, Britain, and France. But there's other powerful countries that are out of that: Germany, India, Japan, just to name some. Brazil should arguably be there, Canada, Australia. Um, but what I would say about the UN as an organization, firstly, it gets enormous criticism because when you see tragedies like what's happening in Syria, it's very, very easy to bash the UN and say it's useless, what's the point, etc., etc. But I think people need to remember why this was set up in the first place. Um, to try and have some sort of dialogue in a troubled world, to have a situation whereby countries will be working together. Now, there is historic precedence for this, the League of Nations after World War One. Clearly, the UN is deeply flawed. There's the internal scandals, which I mentioned with the sexual abuse and so on. But the point I would make is to those who say that the organization should be abolished, what alternative is there? Now, it seems to me that the alternative to the United Nations is isolationism. And that, to me, just seems like going back in time. So the Trump doctrine, I think, is reckless of basically insulting the UN, um, saying, it's useless. On one hand, I understand the American perspective because the US does give a lot of money to the UN. On the other hand, if Trump thinks that he's going to have 4 years of isolationism, he's going to find serious problems. That's just unrealistic. And the interesting thing is the harshest criticism of the UN comes from both the left and right. And there's this kind of smear that those who want international cooperation are globalists. This is one of the main smears used against centrists. But I honestly do put that question to people. If you don't think the UN is a worthwhile organization, if you think it should be abolished, what alternative do you suggest? Clearly, there's many areas the UN can be improved. I think, for example, the Permanent Security Council should perhaps be enlarged to include a few more countries. But then, of course, there's going to be issues because if India was included, China's going to raise issues with that. If Germany and Japan are included, especially Japan, there's going to be controversy. Again, probably from China because of the whole wartime situation. China and Japan still have very tense relations. Um, Also, because of the whole ego aspect of it and the fact that geopolitics always has vested interests, it's going to be near impossible for a UN Secretary General to truly stand up to the Security Council. But what Mr. Guterres can do is kind of be quite clever about it. And I think Mark Malloch Brown's advice is probably sound advice, and Mark Malloch Brown's one of the most skilled diplomats this country has. Um, One thing is for sure, I don't envy Mr. Guterres' role because it is a very, very challenging role. But one of the things Mark Malloch Brown says that he should do is have a big, bold move early on to kind of reinvent the relevance of the UN. Now, the UN gets a lot of slack. I think if Mr. Guterres does something bold early on, that will give a bit of clout to the organization, which really is his principal job. 4 years from now, 10 years from now, the world's still going to have problems, no question about it. When Mr. Guterres leaves, whether it be in 5 years or 10 years, the world's still going to have wars. There's still probably, unfortunately, going to be human rights abuses, and there's going to be problems. But I think he should build on the successful aspects of Ban's legacy, such as the emphasis on human rights and gender equality and the Paris Climate Agreement, but I think he should make his own mark by doing something bold early on. I don't quite know what that would be, but I think certainly something in Syria would be a big thing. Getting Putin, President elect Trump, Theresa May, getting all the major leaders involved in that to put an end to this mess once and for all. And for me, what that involves is ending armaments to the warring parties and the respective backers to put pressure on their side to end this war. Now, I believe Putin can play a big role by saying to Assad, respect the ceasefire, stop firing on rebel areas for now. And those who support the rebels, whether it be Saudi Arabia or the Western powers, need to put pressure on the rebels to also uphold the ceasefire. That to me seems a logical way to at least have some hope of starting to end this mess. Um, I do think that Mr. Guterres needs to be outspoken on issues like human rights. I don't think he should fear the likes of China, because if the UN Secretary General gives the impression that he's not willing to speak out in principles of the UN because some powerful countries are going to criticize him for it, well, then he shouldn't be in the job. But I do think it takes courage to be doing the role that he's doing, and he shouldn't be frightened of countries like China whinging about interference and so on. I thoroughly believe that when authoritarian governments attack the concept of human rights, and they say it's all some Western invention, they're really just reasserting their arrogance, because human rights is universal. Anyway, I'm not going to make this video solely about that issue, although it is a very important issue. Um, Antonio Guterres is facing some very challenging situations with Syria, with other conflicts going on in the world, like that in South Sudan and Iraq and Yemen. Um, he's also facing a Trump presidency, which is threatening to be isolationist. Now, to me, that's just reckless. Um, I hope it is hot air. Trump says a lot of things that he doesn't mean. I hope that's the case. Um, but the UN is facing a very, very uncertain time, and Mr. Guterres has a massive amount of responsibility ahead. So, as citizens of the world, we should wish him well. Not because he as an individual can change everything, but because he is sort of the captain of the ship, in a sense. Um, and it's such a difficult job he has. He strikes me as a reasonable man. He strikes me as an intelligent man and a logical man. So I just hope that he can bring a bit of clout to the organization. Ban Ki-moon wasn't a terrible Secretary General. Some people are already dismissing him that way. I think that's very unfair. I think Ban had some significant achievements, actually. But like I say, no single person can be Superman. Even world leaders can't do that, no matter how powerful. Putin can't, Obama can't, Xi Jinping can't. Um, but I do think one of the strongest things that Antonio Guterres can do at this point is reassert the significance of the UN and insist actually this organization should be relevant. And if I were Mr. Guterres, I would actually challenge the critics. I would say, well, you want isolationism? You want to abolish this organization? What do you suggest? Because the UN can be improved, but the UN as an organization, in my opinion, is more good than bad. I really do believe that. The world is a very troubled place. There is no shortage of armed conflict. There's human rights abuses. There's environmental disaster. There's repression. There's injustice. And no doubt these things are going to exist 10 years from now. But at least there can be a trajectory in the right direction. And that would be something. So I really, really do wish Mr. Guterres well. And I also wish Ban Ki moon well in the rest of his life. It tends to be UN Secretary Generals tend to kind of become respected elder statesmen. That's the case with Kofi Annan. There is rumours that Ban Ki-moon wants to be president of South Korea. Now, if that's true, that would be a first. There's certainly been UN Secretary Generals who have been heads of government before, but I haven't heard of a UN Secretary General that's went on to be a head of government or a head of state. Um, I imagine there'd be some controversy with that because obviously, as UN Secretary General, he's had to be diplomatic. There was a funny sketch on the Stephen Colbert show where Colbert was trying to get Ban Ki moon to spill the beans. He told a funny story about Gaddafi speaking for so long that his interpreter collapsed. But anyway, as UN Secretary General, he had to be very diplomatic. As president of a nation state, he can then afford to be a lot less neutral. It'll be very interesting to see what approach he takes. I think he would be another Kim Dae Jung. I think he would probably go for a kind of rainbow diplomacy with North Korea. Now, I've mixed opinions on that. On one hand, it's kind of admirable. On the other hand, I don't know if you can negotiate with a batshit insane regime like that in Pyongyang, but that's my own opinion. Anyway, I wish Mr. Guterres well. Let me know your thoughts. What I would say though is to those who say that the UN is irrelevant or it's a complete disaster, A, I think they're being short sighted and they're underplaying achievements the UN has had, but B, it's just fickle to attack an organization without suggesting an alternative. So that's it. Um, Antonio Guterres, the ninth UN Secretary General.